Well, welcome everyone. As I was saying, hope everyone had a good time in their breakout rooms. I had a great time. It's always fun to meet new people, and it's fabulous to see old faces and new faces. So thank you all for being here. So we'll go now into the updates that we have from different affinity groups. And thank you for, I know the last meeting was in November, so there's sort of a lull over the holidays, but we still have some really interesting, important, and exciting updates. So I would like to start, please, with Jeremy Dalness. And thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Anne.
How to say your name. I'd seen your L as an I for all these years, and I'm
so great. I was saying that I actually kind of like Danes better. It sounds like a movie star, like Taylor Danes, like Jeremy Danes. Sounds really like cool, but no, it is Dalness. So thank you. Yeah, so very briefly, I know that there are some new faces today. So brief introduction, I am an entrepreneur that has benefited from this work, and I am very missioned to find ways to give back. And presently, the way I'm fulfilling that mission is by creating space and coordinating the creation of a professional association for practitioners of this work. And we've been kind of meeting as a smallish group. We call ourselves the Medicine Midwives. I actually just posted a link in the chat if you want to see and read kind of in detail some of the thoughts that we've put together over the last year or so. But yeah, the goal here is to actually have a professional association that will support all of you, really, relative to co-creating standards of care, advocating on your behalf to various agencies in the federal government, liaising with insurance companies to make sure that reimbursement is properly structured and a real thing. That's sort of the nature of it. And there's a lot of details. We actually spent a lot of time crafting the language that's now on the website that I posted there. So definitely encourage folks to take a read through some of that language. What I wanted to do is make an announcement really to this forum and really kind of a call for participants. We have a meeting coming up on January 22nd, so in 12 days. We are going to meet to formalize a steering committee whose job it will be to elect the first board of directors for the National Association, whatever it's going to be called, right? That'll be part of the exercise. So we really are, we're in that, like, in the shoot here, where we're going to be, going to call ourselves the Midwives as we're trying to birth this thing, and we're getting close, right? And so the next step is to formalize participants in a steering committee who will then elect a board of directors. So it's a great opportunity for us to ensure broad representation of lineages, of practitioners, of ethnicities, background. Like we want to do this right? And so the Medicine Midwives is a very small group that cares, but we want to have a much broader representation when it comes to the steering committee, so that when the ultimate association is formed, that it has, a broad backing and legitimacy from, the folks that are involved in this work today. So if you're feeling called to serve, now is the time to stand up, because we really, the goal of our hope in the form of a goal is that we have a professional association board of directors up and running by this summer. When I first started this working group, it was like, I don't know, 16 months ago. There was a lot of like, oh, let's wait. And now things are moving so fast. It's like, we got to go. So we're in it and we need help, and we need folks that really do want to help shape this thing and sort of self-govern what is going to happen here, because, I think everyone is probably aware of, the alternatives where standards of care might be set by some folks other than the people that are doing the work. And that would be, well, in my opinion, that would be a real travesty. So, so that's really it. I mean, if you guys want to have questions, I know there's lots of updates, so maybe just shoot me a note in the chat or take a look at medicinemidwives.org and reach out to me. I'll just post my email here too. If you got questions, and if you want to participate, again, it's January 22nd, starting at 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, and I'll get you on that invite list. Sound good? Good. Oh, you're on mute, Anne.
just realized that, sorry. Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks to you and your group for all the good work you're doing. It's exciting to be forming something so brand new. And I've been in on some of the meetings. They're very thoughtful meetings about how to really do this right. So thank you. The next update is from Mackenzie Bullard from the Diversity Outreach and Inclusion Affinity Group that has been very active, and I'm very, very grateful to all the good work they've been doing. So we look forward to hearing what you're up to, Mackenzie. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, we have a meeting. We haven't reconvened since the holidays, so the team is going to get back together pretty soon. I know we have a meeting coming up in February with Valeria Chambers and Ben Cook. I'm going to talk about some DOI kind of topics, I'm sure. Excited about that. And then we have some other topics to bring to the group moving forward, from racial equity all the way through other intersections of social justice. I'm just here today to really update people about getting involved. I think the group has grown a little bit, but we're always looking for different ideas, different ways to interact and engage with this community. So I'm going to put my email in the chat. And if you're interested in chatting about becoming a part of the DOI group or getting involved with us in any kind of way, please let me know. We're here to collaborate and do some good work with you. And I'm wishing you all good health and peace in this what's been a tough week. So be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Could you just update the group a little bit about the meeting that we had in December? So the DOI is now organizing meetings on the months that we don't have the bigger meetings, and we had a really powerful meeting in December. Maybe you could tell the group about that in a few sentences, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, part of it, in the spirit of like diversity, outreach, and inclusion is a point of creativity in terms of connecting with each other. So on the months that we don't have meetings, and I think you're talking about hosting like community spaces. Is that
No.
what you were talking about?
Jay, when you actually have speakers come, and you mentioned February, but in December we had Jay Sebelius.
Right. Oh yes, about that meeting specifically.
Please.
Oh yeah. Yes. So we had Jay Sebelius come. Jay is a researcher about trans health, and they gave a great perspective on the need for affirmation, the need to do more research on people that do not necessarily fit into the paradigms of our gender identities, the way that we come to understand ourselves, our identities on many levels. It's not just black and white. It's not just heterosexual, bisexual, and homosexual by any means. It's this idea of embracing the universe of identities that we can have, and if clinicians and policymakers and lawmakers can come to that understanding, then we can really make a big kind of push for multiple perspectives of inclusion in this work. And it was really powerful. So I think that you can find the link to that talk on the website or on YouTube. And please, if you're interested to get connected or know more kind of stuff, we can help facilitate that as well as a group. So
great.
I hope that was enough.
Great. Thank you so much, Mackenzie.
Yeah, no.
We have also an active group, affinity group, looking at contemplative practices and psychedelics. Their two leaders couldn't be here today. Dan Grossman had to be tested for COVID, unfortunately, and didn't think he could get here in time. He's fine, but he needed to be tested. And Ann Dutton is part of the Cptr, and they're on retreat this weekend. But they just wanted people to know that they're meeting next Saturday. If you want to learn anything more about it, Dan's email is dhgrossman92@gmail. You can also go on our website and learn about that affinity group. So, next, we are honored to have a guest from the Bay Area give us an update about the program that she started in 2016. So Janice Phelps, can you please give us an update about the new Cptr program, and specifically let us know what's going to happen in Boston? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne. I appreciate your welcoming me here. I was with you all in the spring, and I'm grateful to be back here. And report out on what we've been working on for bringing a cohort of trainees to Boston and with Boston people. So first, I'd like to tell you, we received 450 applications this year. Our original idea was to have 200 people in the 2 classes, 100 each, but we may very well be able to take in a few more in both Boston and San Francisco, given how many applicants we had and the great need for as many well-trained therapists as possible in the next couple years. We're looking to notify everyone if any of you have applied and you haven't heard yet. We'll be notifying everyone by February 1st, if not sooner. And about a third of the people who've applied have asked for scholarships. And we're very happy to be in a position to offer scholarships between tuition remission, discounts that we will give based on financial need. The George Sarlo Foundation has given us funding for people who are identified as a person of color. And Bprg itself has offered us substantial scholarships, which someone from Bprg will be telling you about after me. So we're really grateful to be able to offer these scholarships. Because of the pandemic, we will have a third of our classes online, and we hope, 2/3 online, and we hope to have 1/3 in person in the fall, pending availability of vaccines and limitations on mutations of the current COVID-19. So TBD on whether we'll be able to meet in the fall, but we're planning on it. And 2/3 of our applicants have been women, interestingly enough. We usually have had a balance of cis female and cis male people, but this year we've gotten 2/3 cis females, interestingly. And 28% of the applicants have identified themselves as a person of color. We have 20 vets who've applied. We'd love to have had more because we'd like to train as many vets as possible, particularly to work with trauma and intractable depression. And the news that you might find interesting, given the LGBTQI population in Boston, 30% of the people who've applied identify themselves as LGBTQI. And we're starting in April, and we're going to offer Bprg a workshop probably in the summer that will be free to you as a gratitude and thank you for your support of us in coming to Boston, and we'll keep you posted on that workshop. We hope to offer continuing ed and CME credits for it for those of you who are licensed here in the room. And we want to give special thanks finally here to the Boston team for hosting us from Bprg. And these are people that Anne St. Gore brought together for us. And I especially want to thank Anne herself and Sherry Race for staffing the work that we'll do when we have our classes in Boston. So that's my report. So thank you, Anne, for having me here. I'm happy to have been able to report out on this. I can't tell you details right now, but we're about to announce a very large grant that we've received starting now for the next 3 years from a large foundation that will help support our growth to Boston. So you'll be getting an announcement about that when we are ready to put it forward. So thanks so much. I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. You've got a great speaker coming in Bob Jesse.
Yes. Thank you so much, Janice. Thank you. Thank you. It's amazing what you're doing. It's really exciting to be along with the ride, with you for the ride. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your help, Anne.
No, my
Key
pleasure.
help.
Really fun. It's terrific. Great. So our next reporter is my wonderful husband, who's been very, very supportive of this whole process all along, and now is taking a key leadership role in helping to organize the Bprg DOI Scholarship Fund. So Bprg Page.
Thanks, love. I'll be brief. A shout out to the Bprg board, particularly my good friend and colleague, Ron Miss, and Ann, of course, Dick Simon, Sherry, and Georgie Ellis. We have started a Bprg DOI Scholarship Fund to serve people of color, Indigenous people, Black people, LGBTQI, and therapists who work with these underserved communities. To date, we've raised $36,970. CIIS has pledged to match the first $50,000, which means that we could in fact have $100,000 this year to give an additional scholarship for these communities. We're very excited. Our long-term plan is to have a permanent endowment that'll throw off enough funds to provide financial support for people who want to do this work and otherwise would not be able to afford it. There is a GoFundMe page on the Bprg website, and there's also a link on the invitation to this particular meeting on the in the email, so look at that. If any of you have grant writing experience or know of somebody who'd like to contribute, it will further our reach if we can reach foundations and other large corporate supporters who might be interested in funding us. So if you know of anybody or interested yourself, please let us know. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Shippen.
And I just wanted to add to everyone that I also put the link to the GoFundMe in the Zoom chat right now.
Great.
Thanks, Sherry.
So
Thank you, Shippen. Thank you, Shippen.
Thanks,
Thank
Shippen.
you, Shippen.
You're so welcome, Janice. It's so exciting to the work you're doing. And we're so glad to be able to help you.
great. And did Shippen ask forcefully enough for everyone to contribute, please? It's been amazing how many people have given. We really, really are grateful. If you know of anyone who's interested in this work and wants to support it in any way, this is a great way to support it. So, so many thanks to all of you who've given. Many thanks to all of you who have reached out to other people to get them to give. I sent out an email to a group of friends with the link and was delighted to get people to contribute. So I think people really want to be part of what's happening. This is a exciting time in this field. It's fun to be in on as it's really taking off. So thank you. So those are all the planned updates I have. I don't usually do this, but because we have fewer updates than usual, I'm just gonna see if there's anyone in this group who would like to share an update in this field. I see a hand, Joe.
Hey y'all, just wanted to share that at Harvard Divinity School on February 22nd, we have a panel on psychedelic chaplaincy, which really excited about. It's gonna have Don Kyman of Synthesis Retreats and conversation with Jamie Beachy of Naropa University and Trace Haythorne of the ACPE, which is kind of the main chaplaincy board in the US, kind of exploring what is psychedelic chaplaincy, what could it be, what should it be, all those types of questions. So I'll send Ann the email once we get an event link for that. But.
And could you also tell us, Joe, about the event that you're moderating with Rachel and Rita this week, please?
Yeah. At through chacruna.net this Wednesday, we have a forum on the role of mysticism in clinical trials, which will be kind of in conversation with the earlier panel they had at the Center for the Study of World Religions. If you attended that one, not a necessary prerequisite to have this conversation. It'll be slightly different. Again, kind of exploring similar themes of what do we mean by mysticism when it's invoked, different potential models for future research when we talk about mysticism and incorporating mysticism in research. So yeah, look forward to seeing y'all there.
Yeah, I would highly recommend that. I was lucky enough to listen to the first one. We've actually posted the video of that first one on our website. So if anyone is interested in the topic, it's a really superb discussion. I highly recommend it. The medicalization of mysticism. It's an important one for all of us to think about. Thank you, Joe, so much. So, and anyone else? I can't see all of you, so raising your hand might not work. Anyone else? I'll try and scroll through. Yeah. Okay.
Just a question for Joe: will that lecture be open to the public? You said I couldn't tell if you said the link might be sent around, but is it just for divinity school folks, or is it public? Or
Oh,
what's
the one at the divinity school will be public. The one through Chacuna, there's a $10 kind of webinar fee, but the divinity school one will be free and open to the public.
Great. All right, terrific. Well, thank you, everyone. So we're due to start in about 25 minutes with Bob, but I know that Bob is here. And we also asked people in our email to come a little bit earlier. So why don't we take 15 minutes now? So that gets us to 1:35. And just take a 15-minute break to move around, do whatever you need to do. Or stay on and chat with people. Certainly you can do that. And then we will aim to get started up again around 1:35, 1:40. I always like to start off thanking my board. So Dick Simon, who I hope is still on by phone, though maybe not, but we know he's with us in spirit. Ron Miss, Georgie Ellis, and Shippen. And then a big shout out to Sherry for making this all work. Thank you, Sherry. Someday we'll see you too. So in thinking about today, in the context of what happened this week, I am just really, really grateful that we have Bob Jesse with us as our speaker. Bob has been such a leader in this community for a long time, and he'll tell you some of his history. I had the good fortune to get to know him during Janice's program at CIS, the first one in 2016. Bob supported Janice in putting it together and then was one of our cohort. So it was a treat to have him be with us. I have always valued Bob for his calm, considered, and very kind wisdom. And that feels like just what we need right now. So thank you, Bob. So I think a lot of people in this community know who Bob is, but let me just introduce him. So he is a quiet guiding force behind the contemporary psychedelic renaissance. He started the Council on Spiritual Practices, which he'll tell us about, and then was instrumental in forming the psilocybin research team at Johns Hopkins. He co-authored some of its papers, including his first, which was entitled Psilocybin Can Occasion Mystical Type Experiences, Having Substantial and Sustained Personal Meaning and Spiritual Significance. That was in 2006. He's led the drafting of foundational documents in this field, a Code of Ethics for Spiritual Guides in 1995, an amicus brief in 2005 for the US Supreme Court in a successful religious liberty case, and a statement on open science in 2017, which has now been signed by numerous leaders in the psychedelic field. Throughout all of his work, he's helped highlight the moral issues around these medicines. Today, Bob will start by sharing with us the history of how he got involved and how he supported the Hopkins team and really formed that team to restart the current psilocybin research. And we will have plenty of time also for questions and answers. So please, as we've done before, you can put your questions in the chat. I may call on you to ask the questions, or I may read the questions if there's several that I will consolidate. But please feel free to put your questions in. I also wanted to add, because it's nice to have a context, that earlier in life, Bob trained at Hopkins in electrical engineering and computer science. He consulted for AT&T Bell Labs, and he worked at Oracle, lastly as a VP of business development. So he brings a vast experience. Thank you so much, Bob, for being with us.
Good afternoon, Anne and everyone, and thank you so much for the very kind introduction. It warms my heart to see what you have going in the Boston area. So congratulations to you and all the people who've made it happen and are keeping it going as a sustaining and growing phenomenon. I hope sometime in the hour we'll get around to talking a bit about the power and importance of community. And what I see that you have done is bring together a very potent and loving and wise community. So, to more of that in the world. Let's see, as part of your introduction, you noted that my training is in electrical engineering and computer science, which means that I have no training at all for formal training for anything I've been doing for the past 30 years. So for anyone on the call who has knowledge that is superior to mine, whether it's psychiatry, pharmacology, the law, whatever, please speak up. I regard myself as an amateur. So given Anne's invitation, I thought it might be possibly helpful, possibly interesting for me to retrace the timeline, some of the steps that brought me into the field instead of pursuing a career in technology. And, you know, all stories have a beginning, but there's a beginning before that and a beginning before that. So I'm choosing one a bit arbitrarily. When I say that the turning point for me began in the very early 1990s. And I found it useful myself to try to bring back into mind the zeitgeist of that period. So let me share some highlights with you about that. Let's see. So Richard Nixon, of course, put in place the Controlled Substances Act and declared a war on drugs. But I think it really amped up in the mid-1980s when the war on drugs took on the aspect of so-called zero tolerance. And zero tolerance meant if you're caught with even so much as a marijuana seed in your car, not only are you a criminal, but your car can be confiscated with basically no due process to get it back. And people involved with any kind of illicit drug use, cannabis or otherwise, were in very significant fear of being busted. Are the phones being tapped? Who's watching the mail? Who's watching who I hang out with? And you know, you can call that paranoia, but there was a war on drugs and there was an announced policy of zero tolerance. Zero tolerance took a statutory form in December of 1989 in the form of a federal law that required schools and colleges to have a drug-free policy and made federal funding contingent upon enforcement of it. So December of 1989, that happens to be the month when I moved from the East Coast to San Francisco to take a job at Oracle. Let's see, what else is going on then? You know, I moved to the Bay Area, not to be in the Bay Area, but to take a job offer that I couldn't refuse. It happened to be in the Bay Area. Turns out the Bay Area was not a bad place to land. And somebody showing up there with an interest in psychedelics, you know, if you have your ears to the ground and network well, you might eventually meet Sasha and Anne Shulgin, which I did at one of the now storied Friday night dinners. And it was either at the end of 1990 or in 1991 that they published their landmark book, P-Call. And keep in mind that they did that, you know, right in the middle of zero tolerance. You've probably read about their informal research group. The friends would get together once in a while to try the best of Sasha's new discoveries. And one person in that circle, a psychologist of considerable note, whose name I think is still not disclosed, told me once he warned Sasha and Anne that publishing that book would be provocative and they could eventually expect some kind of a federal response. And it turns out that he was right. If you've read the books, you know the story. Sasha was eventually required to surrender his analytical license for working with scheduled materials. So that was going on in the beginning of the 1990s. 1991 is the first year that Burning Man graduated from a beach in San Francisco to Black Rock City. So it went from a pretty small phenomenon to something that started to take on more of a life of its own. In 1993, That was the 50th anniversary of Albert Hofmann's discovery of the psychoactivity of LSD. And some brave souls put on a one-day conference in San Francisco at the Unitarian Church. And I recall going to that with great excitement, still working at Oracle, great excitement that, wow, there's going to be an actual conference talking about LSD. And, you know, people were a bit closeted about going to it. Not everyone wanted to wear a name tag. I remember one of the giveaways or something you could buy for 50 cents was a lapel button, a round button, sparkly, that said LSD and then in small letters, 50th anniversary. I bought one and wore it around town for a little while, and some of my wiser friends said, you should take that off. That'll get you in trouble. That was also the time that Rick Strassman, working pretty much on his own at University of New Mexico, exercised the previously unexercised capacity within the Controlled Substances Act that would allow university research with a Schedule I substance. And he's written a book chapter about the experience of working with kind of government catch-22. But he broke through that and was able to give DMT to people who had taken it before in a hospital bed, wired up to all kinds of measuring devices. So the research was starting to thaw a little bit as well. What was not present in 1990 to 1993 thereabouts? Well, there was no World Wide Web to speak of. It was a glimmer in the minds of some researchers that finally emerged into public consciousness in about 1993, 1994. But no Google, just static web pages that would look very simple by today's standards. What else was not present? Not only was there no state legal cannabis, with the exception of a few states like Alaska that had experimented with decriminalization and then criminalized it again, there were some glimmerings. But medical marijuana was not on the horizon, except as a nascent political movement in California. And California's Proposition 215 finally passed in 1996. So I'm going to say that the early 1990s were maybe the waning years of the dark ages with respect to drug policy, paranoia, punishment, inability to do research, or just people figuring that it would be a career killer to do research with psychedelics. My interest in psychedelics have been kindled in junior high school, and I won't really go into that, but it was pretty clear to me that of all the so-called illicit drugs, the psychedelics were the ones of the most fascinating interest. It was clear to me that people who were teaching drug material to young kids, even if they were trying to do it honestly, tried to describe the psychedelics and could not do them justice. I don't think I knew the word ineffable back then, but it was clear that this is the big domain to be explored. And it was many, many years later that I finally had the wherewithal. I was in a good enough place in my life, had the right friend circle to think, okay, I'm going to dip a toe in these waters. And that happened in the mid-1980s. Skip ahead, move to the Bay Area, and start meeting some people a generation or two older than me who are very serious about the psychedelics and scholarly and scientifically aware and approaching them in methodical ways. All the while in the early 1990s, continuing to work for Oracle. Well, what happened? I began hanging out with the Shulgins, meeting some people that they would introduce me to with a serious scholarly interest in psychedelics, including Tom Roberts, Charlie Tart. And I began wondering, why are these actually illegal? You can tell a story. It might not be a good story at the end of the day, but you can at least tell a story about why the potent opiates would be illegal, or why habit-forming stimulants would be illicit substances. But what really is the story for keeping psychedelics illegal? And I began to investigate that in the company of elders and peers. Another angle on this, I'm not a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, at that time pretty far away from the behavioral health field, And through graces from above, people in my family and my friend circle were by and large reasonably healthy, psychologically and physically. And I was aware, we were aware of the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s interest in psychedelics as tools in psychiatry, but that's not the water that we were swimming in. We were swimming in the waters of the Shulgins, taking various chemicals at museum doses and going to museums, still able to talk. You could talk to the docent, you can manage yourself, but you're seeing the art through these new eyes. Or people in the company of some friends having a high dose experience, being tended by friends that may open them up to very new views on themselves and the world. So what was not present here was the notion of treating anything, not treating depression, not treating PTSD, not treating anxiety. So the best frame that I could think of to put around all of this is basically personal exploration and spiritual exploration. Somewhere in this general time frame, I became aware of the work of Houston Smith and some other now departed elders in the field, whose primary interest was not about psychotherapy or therapy of any kind, but using the tools sacramentally, or as what some people have called philosophers' tools. And something caught my attention in 1993, which is that President Clinton signed something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, or Rfra, for those in the know. In 1994, a group of people who attended the Shulgin Friday night dinners organized something at the Esalen Institute in California called the First Pacific Symposium on Psychedelic Drugs. It was in January of 1994. And it was intended to be a small circle of people who would be well positioned to be researchers in psychedelics, with a few other people, a policy person, a lawyer, but mainly bench scientists and psychiatrists. And I remember sitting on the floor at that meeting. It's another story as to how I got invited because I didn't really fit, but I was invited and went. And listened to these scientists describe what wonderful tools they could be for understanding how the brain works. Or if we were to pick up on what had happened decades before, how they might be important additions to psychiatry. And going around the circle, sitting on the floor of the big house at Esalen, it was my turn to introduce myself, and I was the person to say, well, that's all well and good. These probably are incredible tools for healing and incredible tools for science. But my interest is in philosophy and spirituality. And I'm wondering what it would take to get from today to a point where any competent adult could have a psychedelic experience under good circumstances, safeguarded circumstances. And the response to my saying that was kind of nervous laughter around the room. And my interpretation of the laughter, again, nervous laughter, was what I'd said out loud might actually have been the deeper motivation for many people in the room. But it still was not professionally acceptable to say that. The professionally acceptable line was, oh, these are great tools for neuroscience. These are great tools for psychiatry. And very shortly after that meeting is when I left Oracle, first on a leave of absence for a year and then permanently. And part of the game plan here was to meet as many people senior in the field as possible and to have lunches and dinners and say, what is possible? What could move the field forward? What could thaw the war on drugs or unfavorable drug policy? What would it take to draw attention to these materials for their sacramental potential, not only their healing potential? Should also say that, again, I'm trained as an engineer. I went to school at a place where I was basically allowed to deftly skip the entirety of the humanities. So history of religion, history in general was not my cup of tea, and I had some catch-up reading to do for a year, guided by people like Houston Smith, Brother David Stendhal-Rast, Willis Harman. We came up at some point with a statement of purpose for the Council on Spiritual Practices, which has not changed in 25 years. The very short form is that it is to make direct experience of the sacred more available to more people. we left it a purpose agnostic as to the means. And we would remind ourselves that it's with a little electronic device with, electrodes you could glue onto your scalp and a couple of little knobs, the mystical knob, the insight knob, the intensity knob, that we would be equally willing to look at that, and maybe more willing to look at it than psychoactives, where, once you've taken the dose, you're kind of committed, right? You can't just turn down the knob so easily. So the Council on Spiritual Practices has been about the kinds of experiences that these plants and fungi can occasion without being committed to the plants and fungi. But you also have to say, of the known tools, they might be the most potent, the most rapid, the most reliable for occasioning the kinds of experiences that were of interest to us. So a couple years went by, and not very much happened under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And, we'd published an anthology and held a couple of small invitational conferences. But it became pretty clear that those things were not going to move the needle very much. So in 1996, we convened a little meeting, a 3-day meeting, invitational at Esalen, which retroactively was called the CSP Steering Committee meeting. And unlike most conferences, this was not a conference where people presented papers, and then there's Q&A, and people challenge the hypotheses, then the next person stands up and delivers another paper. This was a working meeting. We sat on the floor in a circle in the Maslow room, which I thought was very fitting. And the question before the group was, we all think that there's a role for psychedelics. We all believe, to use the terms of an economist, that the world might be undersupplied with mystical type experience, direct experience of the sacred, which doesn't mean to increase the supply willy-nilly. It just means that on population average, if more people had that kind of inside experience, it might on average be good for the world. So if we believe that, what can we do other than publish books and have an occasional invitational meeting or even a conference? And this group came up with 3 actionable items as if planning, strategy for a business. One was to continue developing a code of ethics for spiritual guides. We went into the meeting with a draft, wondering, would this be helpful? And let me pause here and say that a topic at the meeting and a topic over many lunches and dinners in the years leading up to the 1996 CSP meeting at Esalen was, should we do anything at all? This could be seen as opening Pandora's box. And Houston in particular was very careful to point out that in many, if not all, of the world's religious traditions, mystical experience was held as something esoteric. Houston wrote in a chapter in one of his books that you can still get. I'll just mention the book, Cleansing the Doors of Perception, Chapter 3, Psychedelic Theophanies. It might be the most important dozen-page chapter that you would read in this area. But his point was, it cuts against our democratic grain to imagine that there are experiences which we should have only when blessed to have them by something like a guru, an elder who knows us, who sees where we are on our path, and will discern the time when it might be appropriate to have a high-dose experience, or to discern the time when a new esoteric potent form of meditation might be taught. Think of the ways in which Kundalini awakenings can throw people off of a course. So given Houston's recitation of world history around these kinds of experiences, we had to ask, maybe we should just disband. Maybe we are doing a disservice by thinking that the world would be a better place if on population average, more people had mystical type experience. And at the end of the day, what we decided is that esotericism was going to hit a limit. The first major challenge was the printing press. The next major challenge was the internet, followed by the World Wide Web built on top of the internet. The world is not going to be having very many more secrets. So it's time to turn a new page and figure out how we're going to comport ourselves in a world where esotericism is no longer possible. And that led us to figure, okay, Pandora's box is going to get opened whether we open it or not. And you could argue it was opened in the 50s. You could argue it was opened by Timothy Leary at Cuernavaca. There are plenty of points in time, and you could say that box got opened. So let me return to the steering committee and the three things that we figured we would do. One is publish a code of ethics for spiritual guides. And that too is written without mention of psychedelics, entheogens, plants, chemicals. It is written to apply to any practice which is either intended or likely to bring about a profound state of change in consciousness, which therefore means a period of vulnerability. And what are the conditions that ought to surround that before, during, and after? This code of ethics was not intended to end the conversation about ethics and altered states of consciousness. It was intended to open the conversation. So it was labeled, and to this day is labeled a draft. And quite a few people have taken the draft and improved upon it. So that was one thing we did. The second was to decide that even though our interest was in, for lack of a better word, spirituality, spiritual awakening, spiritual development, that there would be immense value in bringing the lens of science onto this phenomenon. Like the Good Friday experiment, but our intention was not really to replicate that so much as to take it to the next level. And the thinking was, it would be great if we could find a senior researcher in an appropriate field at an institution with great name recognition and a stellar reputation that would pick up psychedelic research. And this is now the key thing, given my background and the background of the people who came together to make all of this happen. The research needs to be with what in the field would be called healthy normals. We knew that other people would come along and study therapy for depression, PTSD, eating disorders, whatever. But we wanted there to be, on the record, in the literature, peer-reviewed, using the best modern methods, research addressing the question, what happens when healthy, normal adults, quote, quote, healthy, normal, have these very profound non-dual type experiences? We talked about what should the plant or chemical be. Well, working with plants in the FDA is very hard, so it's probably going to be a chemical. There was some talk about MDMA in the room, but we knew that Rick and MAPS would have that territory covered. And there was a belief in the room, which has been borne out by research, that MDMA is much less likely, statistically, to bring about a non-dual type experience. So we wanted to focus on the classic psychedelics. The third and last item, major item that we decided upon, was to keep our eyes open for a potential test case under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It would need to be a case with impeccable facts and very, very good optics. It may or may not be a coincidence that one of the 15 people in the room for this working meeting was Jeffrey Bronfman, then the head of the UDV Church in the United States. And within a couple of years, it became clear that Jeffrey's group would actually make a very good test case. Anyhow, those are the things that we decided. The Code of Ethics got developed, still in its draft form, and published. It wasn't very long after that that Bob Schuster, recently retired director of NIDA, was at the meeting, introduced Roland and me. And it wasn't very long after that that I started working with Jeffrey to lay the groundwork for what eventually would be the UDV case that went into the federal court system through the Supreme Court with an 8-0 favorable decision and settled in a good way. It's also worth mentioning that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was an act passed by Congress in order to undo something the Supreme Court had done in 1990. The Supreme Court basically eviscerated the First Amendment guarantee of free exercise of religion, and Congress restored it. The thing to know there is that that happened on a unanimous voice vote in the House and in the Senate by a vote of 97-3. So let me stop there and see what people are curious to talk about.
Wow. Thank you, Bob. Amazing story. I think we are letting it settle. I'm sure people have lots of questions. And thank you so much for laying it out so clearly and bringing us along on that amazing journey.
Could I add one thing?
Yeah.
And I'd be happy to tell stories sometime over a lunch or a dinner table, probably not time or the place now. But this path was helped at so many turns by people well established in their careers who felt they couldn't really announce their interest in psychedelics, but helped in very critical ways. These are people with university positions, in one case a DEA position, in another case an FDA position, who would be willing to take meetings off to the side and listen to the story and say, I'd love to be able to, but I can do this.
Mm.
So there are these little guiding hands at every step of the way. It's I'm getting chills thinking about it.
Mm. Mm. How about thinking about where we are now, Bob? I'd love to hear some thoughts. I mean, having done all that ground laying work, and look where we are now. How does that feel?
Well, there's lots of feelings around it. So I took some care at the start of this segment to try to remind people just how oppressive drug policy was in the mid-1980s through, say, the mid-1990s and beyond. People interested in psychedelics, seeing narcotics officers under every stone, and you wouldn't say certain things on a telephone because all of our calls are being recorded. Turns out many of them were, but they probably weren't back then. And now, just to name one example, Tim Ferriss did a rather bold podcast last year on the topic of childhood sexual abuse. But one thing I took note of, he said in part of his own process, he went on a meditation retreat with Jack Kornfield and took mushrooms. And he did not take pains to say, oh, it was in Mexico or it was in Holland. So it's amazing that lots of people seem pretty free to talk about their psychedelic experience, even if it was last weekend. A lot of people feel you don't have to couch it in, oh, I did that when I was young and foolish 30 years ago. So that's one thing. The zeitgeist has changed. One might question whether it's even going a little too quickly. What else has changed? Finally, this has the full interest of a large swath of scientific community, and even a large swath, so far as I can tell, of psychiatry. I'm not in that field, but in talking with people senior in the field, there seems to be a general sense that the currently available tools are often lacking. So suddenly it's been made okay to talk about and okay to be curious about and okay to be a cheerleader for. And then there's the business side of things. How can I illustrate this best? If you know anything about the financial world, there's private equity funds and venture capital funds and venture capital companies. These are all very high level, $100 million into the $1 billion range enterprises. And eventually, when they're publicly traded companies, this trickles down to what I think is called the retail investing realm, where, there are newsletters. And you can pay $99 a year to get any number of newsletters that will try to advise you about how to change your $100,000 retirement nest egg into a $10 million retirement nest egg. And it has the quality of retail about it. I saw one last month that suddenly turned to psychedelics. And it's, big bannered headlines. Psychedelics, the big new thing, Molecule 520. Who knew that psilocybin is now called Molecule 520? And a big long list of basically hyped, overblown, and sometimes flatly false statements about what psilocybin is now known to do, including Molecule 520 gives Alzheimer's patients their memory back.
Oh, God.
So there's this big feeding frenzy going on. Part of the feeding frenzy is all manner of, I've learned that there's a kind of a flavor of human being called the business person or the entrepreneur, which I'm not much of one of those, but there are people whose special gift is to see opportunity. And it's a wonderful gift. An opportunity means there's an unmet need. And if you form a business and you make it sustainable, you can meet that need. So, thank God there are people like that. But now there are a lot of people like that who are looking at the psychedelic area. And insofar as they see an unmet need that could be met through the FDA or a similar regulatory agency elsewhere in the world, they are correct in discerning that that process is, 20 million would be really cheap. 100 million would be kind of ballpark for a known molecule. If you're in new molecule discovery, it's many times that. So if you think that your play is going to be to move a molecule through the arduous FDA approval process, you need to raise a lot of money. And it's got to come from, one of a small number of places. It comes from philanthropy, which is what is happening with MDMA, and at least on one track with psilocybin, or it's going to come from entrepreneurs, or it's going to come from the government, public monies, or somebody's running a printing press in the basement. It's a joke. But there's not too many options. So it's not a surprise that there are entrepreneurs out there who are looking to raise order of $100 million to move various molecules through the FDA process and elsewhere in the world. And to make that work, they need to have a monopoly. The way you make the money back, the way you return 10x, 20x or more to your early investors is by having a legal monopoly. So in a way, what we're seeing with, patents flying right and left is, it's almost inevitable, but it makes me very sad, that part of it. Sasha Shulgin, Anne Shulgin, the chemist who collaborated with them for decades, it wasn't about enclosing something and claiming it as a monopoly. It was about sharing chemistry and sharing science and sharing ways of using these tools in good ways. So that's not going to go away, but it's being challenged by the need to partition, enclose, and own.
Thank you, Bob. Important things to think about. Steve Rozansky, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Bob, for all the work that you've done in the world. It's really beautiful to watch the Bean speak about this and all the dedication that has been there. Thank you for that first. Somebody had also I had asked how to get a copy of the ethics guidelines, but I think somebody already referred to a website already. However, I'm also interested in what the council is up to these days, or what are your goals currently?
Just to say it briefly, there's a long URL, but a short one. The short one is simply csp.org/code. And, I would encourage you to look around for other codes of ethics. This could be thought of as an outline. And there are a number of people and organizations that have taken that and fleshed it out in ways that are helpful. So you could regard that as an early template, but not current state of the art. So of the people who are involved in the Council on Spiritual Practices and helped guide me and guide those activities, most of them are no longer with us. And over the years, I have not worked to try to replace people and keep an active council going. So CSP now exists as a fund that occasionally receives money and then makes grants to further work in the area. But there's no longer an active council of elders who are meeting on the floor of the Maslow room at Esalen. I feel about that the way I do about the scientific research that's happening around code of ethics. It's like diaspora is a good thing. These are conversations that can now be had by many people because it's no longer stigmatized to be having them.
Great. Thank you. Ron Siegel, would you like to ask your question? please. Ron? I can read it if he's not.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, nice to see you.
So thank you very much, Bob, for filling us in on the history and your experience with this. And just for context, so I'm coming at this as a clinical psychologist who's been very involved in the integration of contemplative practices in psychotherapy, including, realizing in more recent years that there's a fair number of adverse effects, a fair number of people who get involved in meditative practices who, for a variety of reasons that are actually difficult to figure out what all the factors are, run into trouble, get stuck in states that they can't move through very well. And clearly that, that can happen. I was, experimenting with psychedelics, at the time that the first laws came into effect banning them, and there were clearly people who would get in trouble then. So my question for you is really what is your thought about basically less or unfettered access in a world in which many people are going to approach these experiences without the kind of set and setting and frankly screening that might make it more probable that they'll have a productive and useful experience as opposed to running into the kind of experiences that really gave psychedelics a bad name first time round, because there were not an insignificant number of people who had their first psychotic break, who got stuck in various dysphoric psychological states that they didn't pass through very readily.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It's super important. And just to say the obvious, it's important for at least two reasons. One is there are individuals who might be harmed, and if we're more careful, they might not be harmed. And the second is harmed individuals may set us all back. So you mentioned the phrase unfettered access. I think that we're pretty close to unfettered access right now. The mushrooms do grow anywhere. There are 3 states in the union where spores are illegal, and in every other state, spores are legal. Cultivation is not, but the laws in this regard are not very widely enforced. So people who want the mushrooms are going to find them. I'm going to say this one thing and go back to your more important question. I'm less concerned about unfettered access because we have that problem today, and I'm more concerned about promotion. You may know that in the state of California, there would have been an initiative last year, a voter-initiated ballot initiative that did not collect signatures on account of COVID. But if it did, and if it passed, California would have been required to regulate mushrooms no more stringently than it regulates, for example, broccoli or non-psychoactive mushrooms, with the exception that they could put in an age restriction like 18 or greater, but only if that does not impede the business opportunity. Like, this was the most business-friendly piece of proposed legislation I've ever seen. No regulation may be so onerous as to interfere in the profitability of psilocybin mushroom businesses. I would not be in favor of that. Was not in favor of it. And the reason is, it's one thing for somebody to develop a curiosity on their own, to ask some friends about it, to find some mushrooms in the forest and take them with friends. And it's another for people to be manipulated by advertising and promotion into having an experience that they might not have chosen it on their own. So I see the biggest red flag as being promotion. Let's see. I mentioned at the outset that I'm so grateful to see community like this in Boston and anywhere that I see it. This, by the way, includes things like Burning Man camps. And I would hope that people who choose to experiment with psychedelics do so in community, hopefully age-diverse community, profession-diverse community. The notion being that when somebody gets in trouble, it's great to have a support network right there. You mentioned screening, very important. It is commonplace within the world of research that somebody with a personal or family history of psychosis or similar disorders is not a good candidate for taking a psychedelic. Likewise for bipolar. So I think the researchers are exactly right to screen carefully to minimize the likelihood of an adverse event on their watch or an adverse event generally. But we have a lot to learn. I'll say to everyone on this call, we collectively have a big responsibility now to educate people. And, you know, Michael Pollan and many other journalists are helping with this. I think his number one piece of advice to somebody wanting to do a psychedelic is encapsulated in 3 words: get a guide. And we'll learn something about screening, and we'll know something about a setting that is safe for you. And if there is something like a Kundalini awakening, or somebody is stuck in a state that is dysfunctional for them, with luck, your guide will be able to bring resources to bear to help that person.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Joe Welker, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Bob, so much for your work over the years. This feels related actually to your last response when you were talking about esotericism's days being numbered and pointing to the analogous examples of the printing press and the internet being Pandora's boxes. You know, what kinds of have you thought about what kinds of lessons from those Pandora's boxes might be relevant here, and why I feel it's related to the last question is I've been thinking a lot, as many of us probably, about our infamous QAnon shaman guy from this past week. So I'm just curious on your general thoughts on that.
Well, you know, let's start with the QAnon shaman. At one of CSP's early invitational meetings, Charlie Tart gave a talk, which can be found in one of CSP's couple of anthologies, with a title along the lines of "What Must Be Said." And his point is that, you know, we can take this as a working hypothesis, that there's nothing about non-duality, there's nothing about the mystical experience that leads somebody to morally defensible positions. It could even be said, as some people have, that they are neutral, non-specific psychoamplifiers. So turn the clock back a couple of decades. There's the Charles Manson episode, using LSD and other materials basically as a way to bond people around something that is profoundly unhealthy, unwholesome. And, you know, I don't think I'd know exactly what to do about it, except to hope that the communities of practice that surround individuals will pay attention to the grounding principles in their codes of ethics, whether written or unwritten. You know, the CSP code begins with something along the lines of a loving regard for all life, which is really a tall order, right? But that's what I mean by grounding. Feel free to ask a follow-on question. I feel as though you asked more than I've answered.
Not necessarily. You don't have to keep expounding. There's a lot of other questions to get to. I mean, I'm have my own questions or curiosity what you feel about maybe integrating into pre-existing religions versus the challenges or opportunities of trying to create unique spiritual communities, if we don't like the word religion or churches, etc., based around sacramental use of medicines.
Well, you know, as for existing groups, they will come to terms with what Aldous Huxley called the mind changers, on their own terms, at their own pace, and possibly never at all. And Huxley wrote in a 1950s essay, he says, you know, he cannot predict how the institutions will respond, but if they don't, a phenomenon potentially of great cultural significance will spring up outside of them. So, we might see both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rick Kirkland, would you like to ask your questions?
Thanks, Ann. This is so fascinating. I wanted to pick up, Bob, on your sort of mission at CSP, which is, I think I've got you quoted right, to make direct experience of the sacred more available to more people. And it sort of ties back to this notion of, right now, a lot of the research, and I'm a novice in all this, that I've seen is about the medical uses of MDA, psilocybins, et cetera, for helping people with, things that this helps them with. So here's a bunch of healthy normals who are interested in this issue, to use your phrase. And going back to Rachel's point, there's a lot of resistance if you frame it as religion, but if you frame it as science and you look at something like this incredibly popular TED talk that Jill Bolte, I think Taylor did on her stroke of insight, where there's a scientist holding up a brain saying, because of this stroke, I saw the sacred. And it's very intriguing to a lot of people. So is the path to sort of maybe pushing this forward, the research that's going on the interaction of this stuff on the brain and understanding how the brain works, which then opens up the sacred? You provoked that thought as I listened to you. I'd rather hear you. What's your response?
Sure. Very interesting question. It's clear that there are some people who are science-oriented, and when presented with an interesting scientific fact that might be applicable to them, the scientific inquiry will be their entree. And it's pretty clear there are a lot of people who are just not that interested in the science. I'm recalling the first Hopkins paper where we instituted this scale that invites people to compare their data with either an active placebo or psilocybin. Was it on the level of importance of something that happens every day of your life? Maybe the most important thing is, the goodnight kiss to your young kid. Or is it more like the most important thing that happens in a typical month? Which might be, I don't know, you got a promotion, or as a scientist, you made a breakthrough discovery. Or is it more like one of the most important things that happens every 5 years? All the way up to, it's the most important or spiritually significant thing of an entire lifetime. So over a number of studies, and now at a number of centers beyond just Johns Hopkins, it's pretty clear that over 2/3 of the people who are given a high-dose experience will say it was among the top 5 most personally meaningful or spiritually significant of their lives. And of that 2/3 or more, and often it's more than 2/3, about half of them will say it was the single most. Well, right there, that is going to pique the curiosity of a lot of people. And if that happened to your next door neighbor or a colleague at work, you might take the person out to lunch and say, really? You're in your 40s, you're in your 50s, you're well-educated, well-traveled. How could that one day in a session room be what you say is the most important turning point of your life? And you'll hear stories. Let me conclude this thing by saying Houston Smith once reckoned that about half of the population will just have no interest at all in a mystical type experience, and that's fine. Neither necessary nor sufficient for a life well lived. But there might be, and he wasn't being super quantitative, but about another half of the people will be. And when presented with the right opportunity, with the right people and the right safeguards, some of them will say, yeah, I'd like to give that a try.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Mary Gresham has a question.
Yes, Bob, I so appreciate your thoughtful consideration of so many parts of this field and your expertise and your knowledge base. What are you currently doing in relationship to the field of psychedelics, and what do you see as useful expenditures of precious energy and time on behalf of the field?
Do you mean people's time in general, or
What,
mine, or
what
yours?
your precious time and energy, and sort of what's currently for you the place where you really want to make use of your expertise and energy?
Thank you for the question. So, I have a couple of formal engagements. I'm still affiliated with the Johns Hopkins team. And, we did that years ago mainly so that I have a card that will get me through locked doors when I visit, which I wish were more often. I'm on the board of a couple of organizations working in the psychedelic area, including USONA Institute, which is doing for psilocybin as a nonprofit what MAPS is doing for MDMA. I spend a fair amount of time just trying to watch and keep my arms wrapped around a field that's expanding beyond what any one person can keep their arms around. It's a daunting task. I continue to have an interest in what happens outside of the domain of therapeutic application. Let me put it this way. Right now, the number of people, we'll just say in the United States, I think it's true around the world, who are receiving a classic psychedelic, by which I mean to exclude, say, ketamine or cannabis, etc., who have that in a legal setting, it's so small a number that we can round it down to zero. It's only research settings.
Yes.
The federal government collects annual numbers about illicit drug use in the United States. And the last time I looked at them, just shy of 1 million people in the United States took in the last year a psychedelic for the first time.
Wow.
That's 1 million initiations, and doesn't count the people that are coming back for another session, as compared to roughly zero in a research setting, a few dozen here, 100 there. So what's going to happen a couple of years from now, knock on wood, MDMA will be approved and will rapidly move into therapeutic practice, or either commercially through Compass or non-commercially through USONA, psilocybin is available. And thanking Janice for her work and hoping that it continues to scale, suppose that thousands of therapists can be trained, and that the professional association is working hard to make insurance reimbursement as possible, and that the therapy is available to anyone in need. So put out a reasonable best case scenario for the therapeutic applications. What I think is going to be true is that the large majority of all psychedelic use will still be outside of the doctor's office. It will still be people who are experimenting in their backyard in the company of a couple of friends, or a hike in a national forest, or at a music festival, or Burning Man. So if we're concerned about the cultural impact of these materials, we need to keep our eyes on the fact that most of the use is going to be in the wild. So may that use become wiser and better considered, and better surrounded by supportive community, including covering the bases when people are destabilized and need help to get back on their feet after an experience. So, I look for opportunities to support that. A fair amount of my time these days is in one-on-one conversation with people who want to talk about their projects and are asking for feedback. So supporting others is actually a priority for me right now.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful, Bob. Thank you for sharing that. Benoit, you have a question?
Oh, I didn't really have a question, although I would like to say thank you, Bob, because your work is inspirational and has been to me for a while. My response was just in response to Ron's question, just highlighting the need for public information and education. It's something that I believe is really important to be able to support those experiences, as Bob so aptly notes, that are outside of the regulated context and will continue to be.
Thank you. Thank you, Benoit.
Yeah, super important. Let me add to that. You know, there are people who have very serious problems in the mental health domain. Multiple diagnoses, severe traumas, a life of dysfunction built around them. And people like that would do well to seek out appropriately trained professional help. And, you know, let's hope that that's available to them, that they're trained people and it's affordable. But if we set aside the population of people who basically are near to psych emergency or actually need action, you know, a reasonably safeguarded setting is actually not rocket science. Look at the Zendo training, look at cosmic care training in Europe. Most lay people can be trained to do a pretty good job at holding space for somebody journeying. So that's part of the public harm reduction, psych education that we're all embarked upon.
We have one last question from Jonas Di Gregorio.
Thank you. Hi, Bob. Nice to meet you. I'm originally from Italy, from Rome, but I moved to San Francisco a couple of years ago. So I have a question for you, actually a couple of questions. And just to give you a context, when I was finishing college and I was doing philosophy at university, I wanted to write a dissertation about psychoactive sacramentals, like the use of psychedelics in religion and spirituality. And my professor of theology and history of religion asked me if I could share some titles, some books addressing the subject. And when I brought a list of books, they were all in English. He told me, unfortunately, my only other language is French other than Italian. So I'm not able to read these books. I won't be able to help you with this. And I couldn't find any other professor willing to let me write a dissertation on the subject. So I'm now working on a donor advised fund to finance the translation of these wonderful books in different languages. So not just Italian, but also German, French. And right now we are working with Stan Grof to publish his most recent book in different languages, and also Chris Pesch. But there is one book that has been very influential for me, which is Psychoactive Sacramentals, published by the Council on Spiritual Practices. And so the first question for you would be, how can a publisher outside of the United States request foreign rights for this book to be translated and published in other languages? And the other question would be, if you could think of anybody, either yourself or other people, that would like to join this effort to make these books available in different languages, which wouldn't cost much, because in many countries to publish a book is very cheap. But right now there are some barriers in the publishing sector due to COVID, but also due to the fact that less people are reading books. But I still believe that for many people, having a book available in their own language might make the difference to enter this space, as it has been for me, because I got interested in this field thanks to books that I was able to read in English. So these are my questions for you.
All right, to your first question. The Council on Spiritual Practices published books not because it wanted to be a publisher, but because back in the mid-1990s and even a little later, no respectable publisher would publish a book on psychedelics. ESP's first anthology, called Entheogens and the Future of Religion, was collected by Robert Forty, Bob Forty, and he and I successively tried to shop it around to various publishers, and only one publisher offered to take it. It's now defunct. It's called Lumpanics. They have a big long catalog that includes things like 10 steps to a meth lab, or how to blackmail anyone, or the techniques and secrets of spies, or how to assassinate somebody and not get caught. That publisher would take a psychedelic book, and no other publisher. So our strategy has been to publish, or for that matter, to hold conferences until such time as the area became respectable enough that established publishers who know how to publish and promote books would take the books. So CSP has sold the rights to its books. Psychoactive Sacramentals has now been republished, I think, 2 or 3 times. Curiously, each time with a new title. The most recent title, I think, is called Psychedelics and Spirituality. And if you, just look on your favorite online website, you'll see who the publisher is. And they would be the one to license foreign rights, which I think is a great idea.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll follow up with the publisher of the new version. I guess it's Inner Tradition in this case, because that title sounds familiar. And yeah, I mean, I really resonate with your difficulties finding a publisher interested in the subject. And it reminds me of that quote by Aldous Huxley. He said back then, if you would like to write a subject in any kind of field, you would probably find universities available to finance that. But if you want to write about psychedelics, then you can find a lot of resistance. Now, finally, this is changing. But if you think about Arabic countries or Russia, like in those countries, it's still very hard to publish books about this. So I really hope it will change. Well, thank you very much for letting me know. I will follow up with the publisher.
Good. Thank you for doing that.
I love watching these connections being made. It's great. Are you okay with one more question?
Sure.
Because one just came in, and Rick Doblin, I hope it's okay with you. I think you're on, and we'll get you up as soon as we're done here. Thank you, Rick. Marcy Brewer, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi, it's actually, I'm John.
Sorry.
That's okay, we share the same email. So I'm John, Marcy's husband. Yeah, so like I was saying in the chat, so much of our culture is based around individualism. We see, in our society, we have narcissism and is so much of a problem, and might be the key feature of why we have so many mental health issues, and is that we are so individualistic. We may get to the point where we see that in itself may be the curator of a lot of our pathology in our society. And I just wonder, when we think about indigenous cultures and their use of psychedelics, there's a strong foundation of we are one, where people share in the same sleeping spaces, and there's when we think about human attachment, there's so much attachment that's built into the human experience when we think of indigenous cultures, and we just don't have that built into our society. And so when we think about the sacred experience in our society, it's also very individualistic. It's also about, like when I used to go to church, things like that, it's very based around your own sort of salvation. And how do you think, when you think of the sacred experience, how do you think in psychedelics, how do we counter that significant influence, because that's such an influence in our cultural foundation? I don't know if that's too wordy. I have trouble with really short questions, so I apologize if it doesn't make too much sense.
Great. Thank you.
I think I got it. Thank you. It's a totally important topic. Oh, goodness. Let's have this be a little bit about some people at Imperial College looked at psychedelic experience and a scale that measures so-called nature relatedness. And I believe there's also a population level study that looks at this as well. And there's reason to believe that a psychedelic experience can increase somebody's connection to nature writ large. It's unclear how much of that is the psychedelic itself and how much of that is the company that you keep, the friend circle, whatever. Maybe liberal people are more likely to make that connection. But on population average, it seems to be true. So maybe there will be a trend over time where modernity starts to internalize some of what older cultures never lost. In the meanwhile, ego inflation, grandiosity, these are occupational hazards They're hazards for people who take the plants or chemicals in substantial doses. They're even a hazard for people who are working in the field. And the only antidote I know for those things is in the form of a close circle of friends to whom we give an invitation to tap us on the shoulder and say, hey, wait a minute, Bob, I think your ego might be getting in front of you. Or who's running the show there? Do you really want to say that or do that? There's this notion of a profound experience, whether mystical or insight-based. You know, some of those insights are really good. They're actionable. They should be acted upon soon, and others not. Commonplace from decades ago, before my time in the psychedelic world, is after a psychedelic experience, don't get married, don't get divorced, don't quit your day job. And it's the role of friends to say those things. If we come back to mysticism, having its origins in mist, its end in schism, with I, the ego in the middle, this is warned about, and not just around psychedelics. So I don't know what to do except to proceed cautiously and to proceed in the company of friends who will keep us more or less on a good path.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think you really kind of broke that down nicely. That was, I had trouble sort of forming that, and you know, I think you really, that was well put. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes. And I second that. It was a beautiful answer, Bob. Thank you. So thank you to everyone for these wonderful questions. I'm sure we could keep going, but we also want to say thank you to Bob for all of this time. It's been a real treat to have you here in this community, and community is the word that keeps popping up. And let's savor this community. We treasure it, and we're keeping it growing, and we're all doing it together. And your leadership, Bob, has been invaluable. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I'm so impressed and reassured that you have and are building the community that you have.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah. So Rick Doblin is our next. We're incredibly lucky to have two such leaders back to back. So thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, great. I think I first want to react to a bunch of things that came up in the discussion with Bob and in the questions. And I thought just because it's so topical, we might start with the QAnon shaman. So this is a quote about him from an article in Medium. He was previously in the Navy, then got into psychedelic drugs, mushrooms and peyote, and is now a self-initiated shaman who set up something called the Starseed Academy, the Enlightenment and Ascension Mystery School. He's a big believer in using psychedelic ceremonies for mental health. Somehow all these psychedelics failed to turn him into a liberal. So what's really good is that most of the reporting on the QAnon shaman doesn't really talk about his interest in psychedelics. It's more about QAnon and other things that he's been doing. So I think one of the things that Bob talked about was whether this mystical experience is sort of ethical neutral. I don't know if you describe it exactly that way, but somehow that it doesn't necessarily produce feelings of connectedness to other humans or things. And so I think that I'm not so sure about that. And so what I question is, you know, to what depth did the QAnon shaman really go with his psychedelic experiences? You know, how full were they? And, you know, I spoke to a friend of mine this morning, an old girlfriend of mine from a long time ago, and she's talking about, you know, the divine speaking to her about various things. And I was like, you know, the divine is always filtered through our own ego, our own perceptions. You know, we have to be a little bit dubious about, you know, getting the truth unalloyed from any kind of voice that speaks to us. And she got really mad at me at that. So I do think that there's some questions that I have both about my old girlfriend about whether the divine is really speaking to her, but also to what extent this QAnon shaman really did have these profound mystical experiences, and to what extent did he integrate them. So I don't I don't doubt that he's had these psychedelic experiences, that that's something that he's used to help him form his identity. But I think QAnon is before shaman. And so I think his politics are before this mysticism, you could say. So my sense of it is that there is something fundamentally healing about the depth of a mystical experience. We see that with all the reporting from the psilocybin research about how there's something about the depth of the mystical experience that is correlated, particularly potentially even causal for therapeutic outcomes. You know, we didn't find that with MDMA for PTSD, but that does seem to be a pretty consistent finding for psilocybin. So my personal view is that we do need to try to help more and more people have these mystical experiences, or these non-dual experiences, in a context, though, that's sort of helping them to deal with the personality issues that are also, that we all have, our own individual traumas and blind spots and filters. And I think if you can do that, that you may end up with people that are more open-hearted and tolerant and connected to nature and all of that. So my sense is that the QAnon shaman is not a great advertisement for psychedelics, but I don't know really that we know much about what kind of experiences he had and what he's done with them. But you know, anything can be misused. So I do think that, you know, these are just tools, and how we use them is really what determines the benefits and how we integrate them as well. So just to say that, Bob also talked about how you know, psilocybin is more likely to produce non-dual experiences than MDMA. And I completely agree with that. But what Stan Grof has talked about is this phrase that he's used a couple times about being transparent to the transcendent, that there's no real such thing as ego death. The ego never goes away. We need the ego. We need to recognize that we're this limited human being in this life and death cycle. Parts of us are eternal, but parts of us are limited. And so we need to become transparent to the transcendent. And I think one of the things that MDMA does for many people is it does help them see a bigger picture with still ego intact. And so for me, the most mystical experience of my life, after doing, you know, large amounts of classic psychedelics, was an MDMA experience. Where I could sort of see that, you know, gravity and love were woven together, and that I just, you know, this palpable sense of being connected through everything, through gravity. So I do think that there are lots to be said for classic psychedelics, and they are more likely to produce these kind of experiences. But there is a lot of spiritual. Around a third of our people have had a full mystical experience, according to the same questionnaire in the MDMA studies. And that's how we could say that it's not correlated with therapeutic outcome. The other thing that Bob talked about was, you know, this idea that, you know, 1 million people tried psychedelics for the first time this year, and there's way more that have tried it for the second and third time, and that those were all outside of research contexts. And so I think that is fundamentally an important factor to keep in mind, that the medicalization is a means to an end, which is a larger access in legal context to pure drugs with honest information and harm reduction services and treatment on demand for psychedelics and for other drugs as well. And that we need to be really thinking a lot about not only how do we train therapists, but how do we train the population at large into being ones that can really offer peer support and help people understand how to manage their own psychedelic experiences. And so we've just spent $400,000 on expert consultants that we've hired to help us revamp the curriculum for the Zendo training, so that we can offer it to universities, for students, for faculty, for university health services, and also to first responders, and to just people in general. So we're thinking about some sort of a certificate, but not like the CIS certificate. This would just be a much smaller thing. But it would be trying to really capitalize on the incredible interest in psychedelics that has developed in so many people who are coming to this without a lot of the background knowledge. And so we're wanting to really massively scale up the Zendo project. And so that's what we've been working on a lot. And we're also doing fundraising to raise even more money for this, to develop different kinds of curriculums for different groups. And we do have a contract with the city of Denver to do a training for, I think it's about 30 or 40 of their first responders, because they have mushrooms as the lowest enforcement priority. And we want to make sure that their first responders, if they do encounter people having difficult psychedelic trips, they manage it properly and don't tranquilize and don't arrest and don't escalate. And if that goes well, then there's another couple of thousand first responders that the city of Denver would enter into an agreement with us to do that. And we've been approached by the city of Ann Arbor as well. So these are some of the things that we've been working on. Some of the progress that we've been making, I'll briefly talk about that. And then I got two kind of issues that I'd like to discuss in a little bit more length. But what I want to talk about in terms of progress is the Veterans Administration and the Department of Defense. So Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA just set out a press release the other day about a new psychedelic center at the Mount Sinai Medical Center, and that they're very interested in becoming a trainer of VA therapists throughout the system, and that they want to do research, they want to do training, and they want to do treatments as this moves beyond and just the research setting. So it's been 30 years since 1990, now 31 years that we've been trying to work at the VA. And so Rachel is still waiting for DEA approval, but that's going to be coming very soon. We also have approval, FDA approval, not we, but investigator-initiated trial at the Loma Linda VA outside of LA. And so they're just waiting on what's called the Research Advisory Panel of California. California is the only state that has its own review for Schedule I research. And as soon as we get the approval, we're going to try to eliminate this whole panel, because they've been terrible in slowing down research. We've been applying since March to get approval for this study at the VA, and they have not responded. And they've had one person die. They've been without a quorum. They only meet a couple times a year. It's just a terrible way to slow down research with psychedelics. So it's going to be a bit of a race. Who treats the first person first with MDMA inside the VA? Is it Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA, or is it Shannon Remick and her team at the Loma Linda VA? We're also working with Chris Stouffer at the Portland VA about a group therapy study, and he thinks he's got ability to do that from his leadership to get that approved. So that's a long way away, but it does seem like we've made this move now into the VA system. As far as the Department of Defense system, that's going to be more complicated, but even that seems like it might be possible. And so we're working very much on that through a psychiatrist, Bob Kaufman at Walter Reed. And he has got a connection with an expanded access site in Rockville, Maryland, Manish Agrawal. So the Aquilino Cancer Center, they're doing Compass group therapy research with psilocybin. And they're interested in also now giving MDMA to people. And so we may be able to get some active duty soldiers into that site. So that's not definite yet, but there's also some discussions inside the DoD setting about whether they would give some grants. And we also are going to be trying to get a bill passed through our advocacy team that would give $25 million to the National Center for PTSD of the VA to study MDMA PTSD research, and give $25 million to the Centers of Excellence for the Department of Defense to do that as well. So if we can get something like that passed, that would be great. So I think things are really exciting as far as these doors opening in the VA and the Department of Defense, or the VA in particular, and maybe the Department of Defense. Other thing, very quickly is that we just have signed a contract with the city of Denver. So we now have the next plan for the next big psychedelic science conference. And so that's going to be in Denver in June 18th, 25th or so of 2023. And we're calling it the Psychedelic Science 2023 Psychedelic City / Psychedelic City. And the reason we're saying Psychedelic City is a lot of the same team that came together for the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative and DCRIM in Oregon is going to do something similar in Colorado in 2022. So we're hoping for 10,000 people to come to the conference, and we're hoping to have psychedelic sessions as part of it or woven into it. It's kind of tricky because you need a day or so to integrate after a psychedelic session. We don't want to rush people back into a conference. So, but we're going to try to do that. And so that's what we mean by Psychedelic City. And we'll train the first responders and have great contacts already with the governor. So that's going pretty well. We have sued the Attorney General and also the head of the DEA about acting on applications for licenses to grow marijuana for federal research. And about 10 days after our lawsuit, they issued their final rules. So we would like, of course, to take credit for that, but I think our lawsuit had nothing to do with it. They're just months late in issuing these final rules. But their final rules are a poison pill designed to make the DEA the gatekeeper for all the research, and they have to buy all the marijuana, and it just is completely unworkable from a perspective of drug development. They claim it's related to international treaty obligations, but they're exaggerating what they are. And so there is both a legislative maneuver that we're working on as well as further legal attempts. So what we're going to do is, now that there's a Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and Democratic President, and in August of 2016, the DEA said they did want to end the government monopoly on marijuana, licensed private producers. I think within the next 6 months, probably there will be a bunch of licenses issued for people to grow with DEA licenses that can be used in FDA drug development research. And we're almost at the final stage of our marijuana PTSD protocol to submit to the state of Michigan for a $10 million grant. They haven't even announced the grant program. That's going to be in the next couple months, but they're obligated to by the marijuana Michigan Legalization Initiative. The other thing that's been so interesting is we had a meeting with United Health Group. So one of the largest insurers in the United States, and it was a meeting, Roland was on it, Robin Card Harris, myself, and others, and it was specifically about how United Health can cover through insurance psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So they're proactively trying to reach out to people in the field to figure out what their stance is going to be on this and how do they weave this into their coverage. And, in what period of time is it cost effective? And then beyond that, in what period of time might it actually be cost savings? And so it was very encouraging for us to have this discussion with senior management at the United Health Group. The thing that's most encouraging, and what we know about psychedelic therapy, is that it's labor intensive at the beginning, but that it's also can have durable effects. So the time frame that you look at things in terms of cost effectiveness will determine whether insurance companies are going to look at it. And what we learned is that because of what they call churn, that a lot of people change their jobs, change their health insurance companies, that insurance companies have in the past tended to look at a 2-year payoff for certain things. And with psychedelic psychotherapy, they're going to need to look at a longer time frame, I think, because it's pretty cheap to give somebody SSRIs. But then when you think it could be 10 or 20 years that they take them and there are all these side effects and they don't really get that much better, how does that compare to spending a whole bunch of money at the very beginning for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy to try to get at the root cause and then make it so they don't need other medications? So I'm hopeful for the possibility of really obtaining insurance coverage as we work on this over the next couple of years to get it approved, and maybe we will have insurance companies coming along pretty quickly after approval. So that's a hope. I can't say that for sure. The other parts that I really wanted to share that are more difficult is this idea of philanthropy versus investors. And so, yeah, we've raised over $100 million in our history. And that's going to be enough for us to make MDMA into a medicine in the United States, Israel, and Canada. But it's not enough for us to make it into a medicine in Europe or to necessarily bring it all over the world. So we have a new fundraising campaign, $30 million to bring it to Europe and to start doing globalization. Now, we'll find out in the next couple of months how well our fundraising goes. I'm fairly hopeful that we'll be able to get a significant portion of that, if not all of that, from philanthropy. The challenge is that in the rise of for-profit companies, people are thinking, why should I donate? Why don't I just invest? Why don't you just take investors? And then some philanthropists have said, philanthropy is only for things that you can't get funded in other ways, either from the government or from investors. So reserve philanthropy for that. So in general, I believe that, but I also think that philanthropy funded psychedelic research may end up with us working on it in a different way and being more collaborative, being more sharing, where we set our prices. I'll just respond to Rachel. I just saw a question about, are most of your donors individual high net worth individuals, or are you also seeing interest from larger foundations, more mainstream philanthropies? It's really individuals with high net worth. It's not traditional foundations or mainstream philanthropies. That may change, and we're hoping, and every once in a while we probe, as I said, about this idea of trying to get government funding. But so far that transition has not taken place. It's all been people who are either drug policy reformers or have had their own psychedelic experiences or want to help veterans. We just got $50,000 from the Navy SEAL Foundation. So I'd say that's the first donation we received out of over $100 million. Well, and Rebecca Mercer's $1 million. Those are the two ones from people that are interested in veterans, but have no interest in psychedelics, really. It was only because psychedelics could help veterans that they did that. So I think for us, even if we can raise this $30 million, then the next question becomes, what's next? And what's next is both commercialization expenses, but more importantly, or not more importantly, but in addition, I would say, other indications for MDMA. So if we were Compass, if we were for-profit, if we had access to resources in a more unlimited way, what would we be doing? We would be immediately working to explore other phase 2 studies that would look at other indications for MDMA. Now, we are about to start an eating disorder study with MDMA funded by a donor in Canada. Sanjay Singhal has donated $1 million. We've worked with Ben Sessa on MDMA for alcoholism. He's now wanting to raise millions of dollars of his own, but then develop some sort of collaboration with MAPS to work on leveraging all of the data that we have so that he can move forward with MDMA for alcoholism, but then give us some royalties or whatever for the amount of money of whatever we contribute. So we're still trying to work that out with him. There's, as I mentioned, a company before, a group in Germany that's interested in MDMA for postpartum depression. They're also wanting to look at it in a for-profit way. But there's many other uses. So it will take us a while to get an income stream from the sale of MDMA to and there are going to be millions more of commercialization expenses that we need. So what we're thinking is we need like another $150 million or so to really focus on commercialization. And yes, the same Rebecca Mercer who funds Parler. And they were the ones that owned Cambridge Analytica. And it's a bigger story, but it's about trying to develop bipartisan support for the research. So we can talk about that later. But I think the next step, as I'm trying to say, if we get this 30 million, is somewhere like 150 million, and that would be for commercialization and other indications of MDMA. So whether we can get that from philanthropy or whether we need to find impact investors or some other approach to that is not clear. But I think as an organization, now we're well over, we're a little bit over 100 people. We're developing an expertise in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. We've been approached by various groups that want us to help them manage their own clinical trials. They're sort of, you could say, ideas, companies that have been based on an idea but don't have the capacity themselves to do drug development, but either hire out contract research organizations, which is extremely expensive, or they end up approaching us. So far, even Compass is doing, they have about 60 people internally, but they still are working with outside CROs, and USONA does as well. So we're trying to explore whether we can expand into that area to provide CRO services to other researchers, but well, we don't want to do that to prioritize over what we're doing now, which is getting more complicated. So I think our funding story as we go into the future is more complicated than just, oh, we're succeeding, we've been great, and we're gonna continue to raise the money we need to bring these treatments to the people who need them as soon as possible. We shall see. I'm very hopeful, but again, I'm just sort of, we are exploring both areas, you know, because I do think it's imperative on us that we think of the patients and they need these things as quickly as possible, and either we or for-profit, somehow or other, we should be trying to get these treatments to people as quickly as we can, and that's going to require a lot more resources than we have, and whether we will end up trying to do that through philanthropy or through some other way is not clear yet. Now, what's happening this week and maybe next week is our paper on the results of our first phase 3 study, which I've shared with you guys before, is being reviewed by the Lancet. So that's a really big thing, is that most of the papers that go to the Lancet are not sent out for review, but ours was sent out for review, and we should hear this week or next week what the reviewers have to say. So that's going to be a really big thing. It's timed with the New York Times for a big article, and that'll help our fundraising and all of that. So we're hoping on that. But what's happening on Friday is a formal dispute. I see this about an IPO. Yeah, IPO is one possibility. You know, we'll of course be thinking about what kind of pressures you get on you once you do that. You know, it would be an IPO for a public benefit corp, not for a for-profit maximizing corporation. So there's all sorts of safeguards. But anyway, we need business people like Ron and others to help us figure this out. And what the different costs are for each option, what you trade away, what you get. Right. So the formal dispute resolution with FDA is on Friday. And it's about, we've now spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on our lawyers, FDA lawyers. It's been really fascinating. We've already done 2 meetings after we've spent months and months and months preparing our submission, and we're going to have a mock FDA meeting with the former head of the Division of Psychiatry Products and another former FDA official who's a big consultant lawyer now, as acting in the place of the FDA. So, oh, Ron, I see your comment. That's really good. Well, yes, let's talk about this a bit more. So the things that on their dispute at the formal dispute are that it is focused on our protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And so we believe, and those of you who've been through that can maybe share at a later point how important you think that was to have your own MDMA experience in a therapeutic setting. But that's going to be one issue. The other 2 issues are going to be, do we need MD PhDs as the lead therapist, or does there need to be a doctor on call or on site? So these are fundamental issues that we believe FDA is trying to set the groundwork for post-approval standards. And so we're fighting back now because we don't have to do these things in phase 3 studies. We don't have to have doctor on site, doctor on call. We don't have to have MD PhDs. So we think there's a good chance that we've got the data, we can win on that. The challenge is, well, it's all going to be a big challenge. We've had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and go up to the senior levels of FDA. But the one that's more complicated is this idea of how do you provide a legal framework to train therapists in a protocol. And so our lawyers, and I've been challenging this we have lawyers at Hyman Phelps and Peter Barton Hutt at Cummington Burling. So Peter is sort of the dean of the lawyers. And the Hyman Phelps people are, this is their area of expertise. They're $1,000 an hour lawyers. But they made a statement that seemed wrong to me. And they said that it's not legal for FDA to give a protocol for people just to train therapists, that there has to be some sort of scientific data gathering as part of it. That now, scientific and medical, you have to have scientific, particularly for controlled substances, but could you interpret medical to mean the training of therapists so that the medical research is done as informed and educated and sufficiently trained therapists? So this is a situation where we're sort of out alone. Neither Compass nor USONA is trying to get a protocol for psilocybin to give to their therapists. Their therapists can go to Jamaica and take mushrooms. They can go to Amsterdam and take mushrooms, truffles. You know, there are legal alternatives in some ways, but there are none for MDMA. But more importantly, what Peter Barton Hutt has said, and what Tom Loughran, the former head of Psychiatry, says, he does not think it's illegal for the FDA to just give us a protocol to treat patients. I mean, to train therapists in order to help them treat patients. But he thinks it's unprecedented. So the question is, you know, where does the line? Is it illegal, or is it just legal but unprecedented? So we do have a scientific case. We're trying to do self-compassion. We've got all these other measures, but we don't have a control group. So what we've been doing the last few days with Tom and our Peter and others is trying to make the case that what is scientific there's a range of things. And in science, often what you do is in an exploratory study, which this is about MDMA and self-compassion, you have all your factors going together. And then if it works, let's say we show that this thing, MDMA assisted therapy, affects self-compassion in therapists, then later you can come around and saying, well, let's see, how much of that came from the MDMA? How much of that came from the therapeutic setting? So you have a treatment with a lot of elements. And then once that treatment as a package works, then you can start separating the elements and trying to figure out what's the most effective part. But that means that in our initial program right now, where we're asking for 150 people more in this 2-day program, we don't have a control group because it's too expensive. We don't really want to take people's 4 days, and we're not training people to work on a protocol where half the people get therapy with placebo and the other half get therapy with MDMA. We're training people for expanded access, which is where everybody gets MDMA, or for post-approval, again, where everybody gets MDMA. And so this is one of the most expensive parts of our training program, but I think also one of the most important parts. So I think we're establishing so far with these top-notch lawyers that it's not illegal to do this for FDA just to say we approve training. They did that in the 60s. So we actually have letters from Bill Richards to the FDA about how they had a protocol for pastoral counselors and mental health professionals to do LSD in order to prepare them for when their patients who did LSD illicitly came to them and said, this is what I'm struggling with. So the FDA did that in the 60s. So what Tom Loughran said is that doesn't matter, that's old news. You know, you have to sort of argue it out again today. So I think that's what's coming up on Friday. It's really going to have a lot to say about the future of training of psychedelic therapists. How much of it will be above board and legal? How much will therapists go and get illegal MDMA experiences just to know what the drug does? A lot of the people we're trying to train in the VA and other settings are not going to want to do this illegal stuff. I think we really need a legal setting to train therapists. And so that's what this particular fight is about. And we will then struggle with it. And then just as a final step, February 24th is when we have another meeting with FDA to discuss whether the outstanding results that we got from our first phase 3 study are enough for FDA to let us file for approval, or to what extent do they want to see the data from the second phase 3 study. So we're committed, we believe, to complete the second phase 3 study. It's going to be necessary for additional safety data. We think the FDA is going to require it. They may require it for additional efficacy study, but also even if they let us file on the basis of one phase 3 study, it's going to take us another year or so to get to the final meetings to see if they approve the drug. And so we think that we should continue with the phase 3 study, the second one, no matter what. We're going to need to do it no matter what. But if the FDA will let us file without it, then maybe we can expedite the approval process, because by the time that that comes around, hopefully we'll have gotten a lot of people enrolled in the second phase 3 study. So that'll be a really interesting meeting also with FDA coming up. And I guess that's a basic summary of where we're at these days.
Whoa, I'm exhausted just listening to it, Rick.
And I didn't even list all sorts of other stuff.
I'm sure you didn't, but wow, amazing, amazing. Does anyone?
Oh, so so I do see one question. If they decide to expedite, then does it mean we can give everyone MDMA rather than randomize? If so, when do we find out? Unfortunately, no, it does not mean that. We did explore already this idea of maybe we can negotiate with FDA to get rid of the placebo group. You know, I think I mentioned before that we had one woman in our first phase 3 study attempt to kill herself twice during the study, and another woman was so profoundly troubled by serious suicidal ideation that she referred herself to a mental hospital to avoid self-harm. And both of those people were in the placebo group. And so there are more risks. We showed no suicide attempts in the MDMA group, only in the placebo group. And but we just don't think that the FDA, if they will want to see the second study, they will need the placebo group for the efficacy. Otherwise, they won't trust the data. So we basically have to keep it. Libby just asked this idea of, do you expect any change in FDA people due to the change in administration? Probably, but I don't think that that's going to change things. I mean, because of I think it's more what we're dealing with is FDA officials worried about their reputations. If they approve something that's never been approved before, and then something goes wrong, and then they're going to be blamed for it. So they're trying to be, in their mind, more rigorous. That's where this MD PhD requirement comes from. So I really don't see any fundamental change because of the political dynamics, other than in marijuana, there's less resistance to licensing companies for marijuana. There may be, well, I think other than the pressure that's been put on FDA to expedite the vaccines, they've been pretty good to be insulated from politics. So anyway, I don't think that'll change.
Great. Well, thank you as always, Rick. And I want to apologize. I didn't introduce Rick. And I think that's because I assumed everyone knows who you are. And I hope by now you've all figured out who he is and how grateful we all are, Rick, for all of what you've done for this field. It's amazing. So always great to see you. Thank you. So, to the community, people are welcome to stay on. We have another half hour to be open. And anyone who wants to or needs to leave, you're welcome to do that too.
What's coming up in the future?
Oh, so we have in February on the, it's in our letter. I don't have the exact date in front of me. We have a DOI with 2 people from the Cambridge Health Alliance who work specifically on making psychiatric therapy available to a wide range of people of color. And then in March, let me see, the February date is the 28th. And then our March 21st date, we have people who are, some of them are on this, but Manish Agrawal and his team from Sunstone is going to talk to us about what they're doing down there, which is very exciting work. And we'll keep you posted with our emails as to what else is going on. Feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions. And my husband is saying, ask for money. What do I donate? We already asked you to donate to the
Scholarship fund.
the Cptr DOI scholarship fund. So many of you haven't, quite a few of you did today. So thank you so much for that. So This has been wonderful, as always. And as we've said, the theme of the day has been community and how important this community is to me personally, and I think to all of us. We're so grateful to have each other. Thank you. Thank you.
Man.
Go to the gallery view.
This was great. I would love to stay in touch with people, especially in New England, and keep this conversation going. I'm completely energized after this meeting, and I can put my email address here in the chat box if anybody wants to sort of stay in touch. I was just in Jamaica. I was telling my group, my breakout group earlier, I was just in Jamaica, and I can talk about it kind of openly. And I'm not going to talk about it openly now, but had just some really amazing experiences. And I'm also a therapist in private practice and want to figure out a way to get this work into the hands of people who really would benefit from it. So,
Eileen, are you on our list, the BPRG list?
yes, I am. I just joined after talking to Ron Siegel last weekend.
Great. Well, welcome, and we know how to get hold of you then. Where in the Boston area are you?
I'm in Providence, Rhode Island.
Oh, great. Terrific. Well, great to have you along, and thanks for your enthusiasm.
Thank you. This was really awesome. Thanks, Ron.
This is great. Thanks to everyone for all your lovely messages in the chat. It's so much fun.
I have a question. We just had two people in an earlier group. There were two people who have contracts on their desk with private companies. One was Field Trip and the other one was something in Canada. And they were trying to work through, you know, whether to go this private company route and what the ethics of that are and how to protect their own practice and all the non-compete clauses. Who would you refer those people to for help with processing that?
I don't have an answer to that. It's a great question. Rick, do you have an answer to that? Did you hear that? Or Bob?
There's the MAPS psychedelic integration list, and then there's also psychedelic.support. So I think, is that the...
Oh, it's people who have our training, who are being asked to sign contracts with private companies.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I missed that question. It's tricky. We've had people, several people who were on the verge of doing that, and we raised some concerns, and some of them did not do that. I guess, could you speak a bit about what you see as the trade-offs or so? I mean, as far as somebody to speak to, though, I would say that Ingmar Gorman, who was a therapist that works on our phase 2, phase 3 studies in New York, he was approached by Field Trip, and he ended up starting his own company. Also, Ann Wagner, who was approached by Field Trip, she also didn't want to go with them and started her own group. I think some of these companies are looking mainly at their stock price and trying to sign up a bunch of clinics, and you know, I don't know what value add they're having. So I guess the question is, what are they offering, and what are they asking you to trade away?
The non-compete clauses are a definite problem.
Yeah, I think that you have more leverage than they do at this moment, in the sense that these are companies trying to really, you know, enter the field, and they need treatment sites, and they don't have And then that's what their claim to value creation is going to be for their stockholders. So how does it mean non-compete though? What does that mean?
One of them, it was written in the contract that anything he does that's in any way related to this work belongs to them.
That was the field trip thing. That's why Ingmar Gorman didn't want to sign up with field trip. Yeah, I think you may see what they do if you just strike those things out.
Mm-hmm.
I can offer a thought about this.
Yeah.
Does everyone know George Greer? Psychiatrist, now retired, worked with Rick and MAPS many, many years ago, has been involved with the field, is still involved with Hefter. I don't know how available he is for random phone calls or emails, but I wish somehow this story from George Greer could make it into the record. As a non-psychedelically practicing psychiatrist, I'm going to be wrong in the details, but probably accurate to the overall picture. He worked in a very small group practice for many years, where the other psychiatrists were in the same building, same receptionist. Maybe there was an ownership structure where the senior partners owned more of the practice and the junior partners less of the practice, but they were pretty much all in it together. And then at some point, one of the partners with a larger ownership stake sold out to a much larger medical practice. And George will tell you how that changed his own practice of psychiatry. It's no longer 3 or 4 people in the same building making up the fee structures or deciding how the practice will be run with respect to, reimbursements. But he could live with that. And then there was another successive sale where the practice was sold to a company that isn't even exclusively focused on medicine. And George will just tell you that his professional life went downhill with every step. And it wasn't about non-compete clauses. It was about who's controlling the practice, how much autonomy does the individual practitioner have. So again, it'd be great if you could write a little essay about that.
But Els, what is it that they're offering that you see as an advantage? What are they offering?
Oh, just to be able to show up to work and not have to run a business.
And also a pretty lucrative offer, apparently. Right? That's what the person that was talking about the dilemma was saying.
Oh, right. Yeah, his was going to be a lot more money.
Yeah, because a lot of times they see their value in terms of the stock price, not in terms of the business, the core business. It's about what, we got $1.6 billion for Compass. Field Trip is 180 million. MindMed is over $1 billion. I mean, they're ridiculous valuations, but that's where they make their money. So Ron, do you want to add anything to this?
Well, I will certainly echo your comment that the valuations seem to be extremely high. And I think, these are sweeping generalizations, but, as someone who's worked in publicly traded corporations, what Rick is referring to, I think, is very often the case, that a strategy for a business to grow and develop and increase its value can be to acquire or help set up a network of, in this case, think of them as sort of, each practice delivering the treatments is part of the network of the larger corporation. And if they can multiply that network by entering into the kind of agreements that you're describing, that's favorable news that they can communicate to maintain or increase their stock price. And that's, a major objective. I'm not an attorney. I think that anyone who looks at legal documents such as the ones that you're considering would do well to have an attorney, look at it and offer you their advice. But for sure, the corporation is going to be looking to, control, I think as Bob has referred to, many, if not all aspects of the, each of these these individual treatment centers operations, and fold them up, consolidate them into the corporate whole, which is how they get valued. So beware.
Yeah, well, I'll just share a story about that with field trips. So we just, this eating disorder study, the donor said that we needed to work with the field trip site, which is in Toronto. And so Ronan Levy, who's the head of field trip, sent me this press release that he wanted to send out for his stock price that announced this collaboration between MAPS and field trip. And the first draft of the press release, it's like, it didn't even say that it's a MAPS sponsored study, that all we're doing is renting their space and one of their staff is working on the study and we're bringing it out. So we completely redid the press release to make it more accurate. And then they put it out, and yeah, the whole person was really for their stock price. And so the tendency was to just hype it over much. We also do have an agreement with Numinous, which is another for-profit company in Vancouver, to work with them on expanded access. So we are developing certain collaborations with for-profits, and Numinous sort of grew out of the phase 3, phase 2 site in Vancouver, and they're really more doctors and therapists than they are business people who came from cannabis and want to make more money in psychedelics now. So I think these kind of collaborations are something to explore. I'm not against them. I think that most of the clinics that we have are set up as for-profit clinics by teams of doctors and therapists, and that's okay. But we just have to be really clear, what kind of agreements we make, and when they want to own all your intellectual property or own everything you've done before, that's going too far.
I think that's what they were asking, but as you suggested, another person on the call who had the same thing or he was thinking about doing exactly what you said, which was crossing out all the things he didn't find compatible and just offering it to them and saying, these are the things I'm not willing to agree with. So, but they were making the point that they don't have the income right now to afford a lawyer to really go, deep into it. But thank you.
Well, you could actually, we have a couple lawyers on staff. So if people, I'll tell you if you want them to briefly look at it, just to give you ideas, because they've been looking at all of our contracts with Numinous, with others. So it would be Ismail Ali would be the person to send it to, and it's really simple. So it's ISMAIL, Ismail at maps.org. And if somebody wanted him to look over a contract, CC me at rick@maps.org, and then he can just give you some brief ideas.
Thank you. Very generous, as always, Rick. Thank you.
Well, generous. I mean, these people were from Berkeley Law School, and Berkeley Law School has this fellowship program. So Berkeley Law School we have two people that are lawyers on staff, and Leslie Boer is the other one. But both of them, their first year with us was paid for by Berkeley Law School.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. That's great. Oh. So, no more questions or chatting? I think we could say goodbye. Thank you, everyone. It's been wonderful to have all of you with us. Love you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks
so much.
Hi, everyone.
Everybody, thank you.
Thank you.